freezing Atlantic spray hit Oberstfreiter Hans Richter's face, not in the cramped, oil-reeking belly of a U-boat, but standing on the open deck of a massive, gray-hulled American transport ship, the SS West Point, churning steadily westward. Just 3 weeks prior, he had been fighting and losing in the dust and heat near Tunis, convinced that if he wasn't killed by an Allied shell, he would surely be left to rot in some sun-baked, flea-ridden Allied cage in North Africa. He had expected barbed wire, starvation, and vengeful guards. The standard currency of captivity, he had been taught, was the inevitable lot of the German soldier. But as the coast of the United States, a land he had only ever seen symbolized by flashing propaganda films of skyscrapers and wealth, began to rise tentatively on the horizon, the silence aboard the ship was more jarring than any bombardment. It was the silence of hundreds of defeated, exhausted men, gazing at the untouched landscape of the enemy. They were landing at Hampton Roads, Virginia in late 1943, and the first shock was not the overwhelming military presence, but the sheer, staggering, peacetime normality of the place. They were marched from the docks and placed onto trains, not cattle cars, but seemingly comfortable coaches, similar to what a civilian might use, though the windows were shuttered or painted over. Hans pressed his face against a crack, inhaling the strange, sweet scent of a world not at war. The trains began to roll, heading inland, away from the strategically vulnerable coast and into the American heartland. A terra incognita where the war was something read about in censored papers, not experienced in the smell of burning powder and blood. The scale of the movement was incomprehensible. By 1945, nearly 425,000 German prisoners of war would be interned across 47 states, in over 600 main camps and satellite worksites. This wasn't just a few dozen captured airmen. This was the logistical feat of moving and housing 500,000 enemy soldiers, right in the backyard of the American public. As the train crossed the vast plains of the Midwest, Hans, who had grown up in the carefully managed, resource-starved environment of Nazi Germany, saw fields stretching to the horizon that seemed to hold enough food to feed the entire European continent twice over. He saw tractors, massive and powerful, working land that had never felt the tread of a hostile boot. The wealth and industrial might of the US, which they had been told was crumbling under Bolshevism and Jewish financiers, was not an abstraction. It was visible from the window of their prison train. It was a silent, devastating declaration of the war's inevitable conclusion, rendered not through superior tactics or overwhelming force, but through pure, unbelievable material abundance. This journey inland was the start of a profound, and often unsettling, transformation for every man aboard. They had been prepared to die for the fatherland. They were now being prepared to live in the enemy's country, under conditions that violated every expectation of wartime misery they had been taught to anticipate. The fear was replaced by confusion, and the anger was slowly eroded by the strange, disorienting sensation of safety. The logistical architecture necessary to hold nearly 500,000 Axis prisoners within the continental United States dwarfed any previous American effort to manage detainees, creating a sprawling, mostly invisible network that stretched from the pine forests of Maine to the deserts of Arizona. This was not a centralized, single camp system, but a constellation of temporary cities designed to be self-sufficient yet utterly secure. The camps were often established on land previously used as civilian conservation corps sites or former military training areas, quickly converted with the ubiquitous materials of wartime construction. Standardized wooden barracks, chain-link fences, and rows of searchlights. Crucially, the U.S. military followed the strict letter of the 1929 Geneva Convention, a decision rooted less in humanitarianism than in the cold calculus of reciprocity, ensuring that captured American airmen in German hands received comparable treatment. This adherence mandated specific square footage per man, sufficient medical care, regular inspection by neutral parties like the Swiss Red Cross, and, perhaps most controversially to some Americans, that enlisted prisoners must be offered the opportunity to work, paid at the prevailing local military wage, though much of this was taken back for maintenance. The administration of the camps fell largely to the Provost Marshal General's Office, PMGO, which quickly realized that holding hundreds of thousands of healthy young men in idleness was a recipe for trouble. The work program became vital, both for managing morale and for solving a critical national problem: the severe manpower shortage caused by the mass mobilization of American men into the armed services. Farmers across the South and Midwest, desperate for laborers to bring in cotton, harvest sugar beets, and chop wood, suddenly had access to reliable, if unexpected, manpower. The prisoners were, in effect, leased out to private employers, escorted daily by American guards, working alongside local civilians, often sharing the fields with Mexican guest workers or African-American farmhands. This close interaction created a layer of cultural complexity that few had anticipated. The prisoners lived in a world where the primary enemy was boredom, punctuated by manual labor that, while often grueling, was nowhere near the crushing psychological and physical demands of the Eastern Front or the bomber-infested skies of the West. The contrast between the U.S. experience and the conditions endured by Allied POWs in Japan or Germany was stark. Yet this safety and relative comfort bred a different kind of psychological burden. The gnawing guilt of living well while comrades died, coupled with the slow, inevitable realization that the cause they fought for was failing far away. The American guards, often older men or those deemed medically unfit for overseas service, found themselves as unwilling diplomats and managers, mediating disputes among prisoners, ensuring adherence to the Geneva Convention, and struggling to maintain authority over men who, despite being defeated, retained a fierce ideological pride. The efficiency of the operation, the ability of the U.S. to mobilize, transport, and sustain this massive captive population while simultaneously fielding armies across two oceans, underscored the very military and economic disparity that had led to the prisoners' defeat in the first place. The journey inward was a prolonged exercise in cognitive dissonance for the German soldier. Imagine an infantryman captured in the ruins of Monte Cassino, accustomed to surviving on ersatz coffee and thin rations, suddenly finding himself in a train heading toward Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, or Camp Hearn, Texas. When the blinds were finally drawn up, revealing the flat, immense expanse of the American landscape, the German worldview, forged in the cramped, resource-scarce nationalism of the Third Reich, began to crack. The sheer size of the country was overwhelming. The distances traveled seemed endless, dwarfing the geography of Europe. But it was the appearance of the civilians that proved the most unsettling initial observation. The propaganda machine had assured them that America was a soft, decadent nation teetering on economic collapse, its people demoralized and its streets filled with rioters. Instead, they saw well-dressed, well-fed civilians, driving cars that seemed unnecessarily large, and encountering markets overflowing with goods, luxuries long unavailable even to high-ranking German officers back home. Corporal Klaus Muller, interned in a camp near Crossville, Tennessee, recounted his amazement at watching American children drop discarded food into garbage bins, a horrifying waste to a man whose family had been taught to treasure every crumb. The vast difference in living standards served as a quiet, constant propaganda against the Nazi narrative. The camps themselves, though surrounded by coils of wire, were not the dungeons they had expected. They were orderly, clean, and provided adequate, if monotonous, food. The barracks were heated in the winter, and though they were separated from the surrounding communities, the occasional glimpses of American life were unavoidable. For many of the younger men, particularly those conscripted late in the war who had little ideological grounding, the experience became a strange form of educational tourism. They learned about things forbidden in Germany: jazz music, American cinema, and the existence of a genuinely free press. The local communities, however, reacted with a complex mixture of curiosity, fear, and resentment. While U.S. officials insisted on strict separation, the sheer necessity of the labor program meant that the prisoners were regularly seen working in fields, on logging operations, or even helping clear hurricane debris in coastal towns. For many Americans, particularly in the Deep South and the rural Midwest, these were the first actual Germans they had ever encountered. They were not the inhuman monsters of the posters. They were young, surprisingly polite, and clearly skilled laborers. This humanizing element, while often suppressed by wartime fervor, was a quiet challenge to the absolute hatred the conflict demanded. Yet, beneath the surface of relative calm, the camps contained a simmering ideological war, as the hardened Nazi fanatics sought to maintain control and purify the spirit of their defeated comrades, turning the safety of the American heartland into a crucible of political and psychological stress. The true strategic value of the German POWs in America lay not just in keeping them contained, but in leveraging their labor to sustain the American war machine they were ostensibly fighting. The work detail became the cornerstone of the system. By 1944, over 300,000 prisoners were engaged in daily labor, contributing significantly to sectors crippled by mobilization. Agricultural labor was paramount. In states like Kansas, they harvested wheat. In the Southwest, they picked cotton. And in the Rocky Mountain states, they dug sugar beets. This was not token labor. It was essential, highly organized manual work, often saving entire harvests. Beyond farming, POWs were used in timber harvesting across the Pacific Northwest, in repairing and maintaining railway lines vital for troop movements, and even in non-essential but resource-intensive industries, like cutting pulpwood in Maine. The arrangement was a logistical triumph and a philosophical oddity. These men, captured on foreign soil, were now directly contributing to the economic health of the nation dedicated to their utter destruction. The prisoners were paid 80 cents per day, credited to them in script that could be used in the camp canteens to purchase items like cigarettes, soap, or small amenities, fulfilling the requirement of the Geneva Convention. However, this payment was a fraction of the prevailing civilian wage, leading to inevitable tensions with local American labor unions, which feared the system was depressing wages. The U.S. government argued convincingly that the work was vital and that, without the POWs, much of the food needed to feed both the U.S. military and its global allies would simply rot in the fields. The labor scheme also helped define the unique structure of American captivity. To facilitate the widespread use of labor, hundreds of smaller, temporary satellite camps were established, often comprising just a few barracks placed directly adjacent to the fields or factories where the men worked. This proximity meant that the control structure was often loose, relying more on fences and local guard detachments than on overwhelming force. In these satellite camps, the interaction between the German prisoners and the American civilians, the farmers, the foremen, the wives who sometimes brought them water, became far more personal and complex than in the large, centralized receiving camps. A strange kind of understanding sometimes developed. Shared labor in the sweltering heat or freezing cold transcended the official enmity of the war. Many farmers, themselves struggling patriarchs whose sons were fighting in Europe, saw the POWs not as symbols of Nazism, but as surrogate sons performing necessary work. This unique situation created a powerful, silent conflict. The war was a life-and-death struggle far away, but here, on American soil, it was reduced to a shared struggle against a bad harvest or a stuck engine. Blurring the moral lines of who exactly the enemy was when he was helping you feed your family. The most treacherous battle fought within the seemingly benign confines of the American POW camps was an ideological civil war waged by the prisoners themselves. The system of confinement, designed for safety and efficiency, inadvertently became a pressure cooker for the deep political divisions present within the German military. On one side stood the black sheep, Schwarzkopf, the fanatical, often young and hardened Nazis, frequently drawn from the Waffen-SS, U-boat crews, or experienced Afrika Korps veterans who saw their surrender as a tactical setback, not a moral failure. They viewed the relative ease of American captivity as a threat, fearing that comfort and freedom would erode German fighting spirit and loyalty to the Führer. On the other side were the whites, Weiss, the disillusioned, the older reservists, and the conscripts who recognized the war was lost and were simply grateful to be safe. The black sheep enforced rigid Nazi discipline, often through intimidation, threats, and even brutal violence. They established secret camp courts, or Femmedrick Dash, where those who showed enthusiasm for work, expressed doubt about the Führer, or interacted too warmly with American guards were marked as traitors. This ideological policing was not theoretical. Documented cases of murder occurred in camps across the U.S., from Oklahoma to Utah, where non-believers were beaten or hanged, often leaving notes claiming they committed suicide or died in training accidents. This internal reign of terror posed a massive problem for the American military command. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were expected to maintain their own internal structure, led by the highest-ranking officer, but when that structure was being used to commit murder, U.S. intervention became unavoidable. The solution was mass segregation. The U.S. military began a painstaking process, often guided by intelligence gathered from loyal German prisoners and through careful observation of behavior, to separate the hardcore Nazis from the rest of the population. Fanatics were sent to isolated, high-security camps like Camp Alva, Oklahoma, or Fort Stanton, New Mexico, where they could no longer intimidate the moderates. This segregation was critical, allowing the majority of prisoners to breathe easier, interact more freely with American culture, and eventually open themselves up to the forthcoming re-education efforts. But the conflict highlights a chilling reality. Even in defeat and distance, the toxic ideology of Nazism remained lethal, demonstrating its self-perpetuating nature far from the ruins of the Reich. The Americans realized they weren't just guarding soldiers. They were managing a complex, fractured political entity. They were holding men who were simultaneously enemies of the United States and enemies of each other. This raises a difficult moral question that defined the experience of the captured German soldier and the conscience of the American guards. When an enemy is held safely behind wire, and they begin to kill their own comrades to preserve a hateful ideology, does the mandate of humanitarian protection under international law give way to the necessity of immediate moral intervention? How much responsibility does the confining power bear for the internal politics of its prisoners? I'd like to hear what you think. Share your thoughts on this ethical dilemma in the comments below. Freed from the tyranny of the internal Nazi enforcers through strategic segregation, the vast majority of German prisoners were exposed to an American cultural deluge that began to subtly, yet profoundly, shift their perspectives. Life in the segregated white camps allowed for greater interaction with the outside world. This meant access to uncensored American media, newspapers, magazines, and radio. The German government had carefully controlled information for a decade, creating a closed ideological loop. Suddenly, these young men, many having never lived outside of the Third Reich, were presented with alternative realities. They heard music that was forbidden, especially American jazz, which the Nazis had branded Negro-Jewish degeneracy music. Initially met with skepticism or outright disdain by the ideologues, the energetic, rhythmic quality of Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller soon proved intoxicating to the younger prisoners, providing a soundtrack to their confinement that was decidedly non-martial. More significant than the music was the exposure to American daily life. Guards, nurses, civilian workers, and local farmers interacted with them on a non-combat level. Many prisoners, eager to stave off boredom, began intensively studying English. This linguistic bridge allowed for informal but eye-opening conversations. They learned about things that simply did not exist in their world: the two-party political system, the concept of a free press that openly criticized the government, and the staggering cultural heterogeneity of American society. They observed African-American labor gangs working nearby, noting the deep racial segregation of the American South, a system that ironically reminded some of the rigid hierarchy they had left behind, while simultaneously confounding the Nazi narrative of American unity and racial purity. The most potent tool of this cultural conversion was the cinema. American authorities realized that visual information was the most effective way to challenge entrenched beliefs. They showed the prisoners films that depicted American life, not propaganda, but everyday dramas and comedies. More directly impactful were films specifically designed to puncture the myth of the heroic, clean war. Footage of bombing raids on German cities and, later, raw and censored footage of the liberation of the concentration camps. Watching the horrors of Dachau and Buchenwald, men who had previously claimed ignorance or argued that the atrocities were mere Allied propaganda were often reduced to stunned silence, realizing the full moral cost of the regime they had served. This cultural exchange was not instantaneous conversion, but it was a powerful seed of doubt. The German soldier arrived expecting a brutal prison experience, confirming their belief in the enemy's barbarity. Instead, they found a nation powerful enough to be generous, secure enough to be tolerant, and wealthy enough to treat its prisoners far better than they treated their own civilians at home. This unexpected encounter with democracy's material and moral success proved a far more effective weapon against Nazism than any sermon or lecture could have been. While the majority of German prisoners resigned themselves to the safe tedium of captivity, embracing the hard work and waiting out the war, the urge to escape remained a potent psychological drive for a restless few. However, escapes from American soil quickly became the stuff of wartime anecdotes rather than actual security threats. Unlike the intricate, cooperative, and often successful escape tunnels dug under German camps in Europe like Stalag Luft III, attempts in the US were generally characterized by poor planning, profound geographic ignorance, and a rapid, almost comical failure rate. The fundamental obstacle was simple: the sheer size and cultural uniformity of the enemy territory. A captured British airman escaping in Poland might have a chance of finding underground support, speaking a vaguely familiar language, and navigating a landscape where the front lines were theoretically reachable. A German corporal escaping from a camp in Idaho or Oklahoma, speaking only rudimentary English, stood out immediately. The vast open spaces, while providing freedom from the wire, quickly became deadly traps of exposure and isolation. The most famous escape was arguably the mass breakout from Camp Papago Park, Arizona, in December 1944. 25 German submariners, known for their discipline and cunning, executed an ingenious escape plan, digging a tunnel 178 feet long that emerged outside the camp limits and led directly to the dry bed of the Salt River. Their goal was not to reach Germany, but to steal boats in the Gulf of California and sail back across the Pacific. While the plan was meticulous, the execution suffered from the same lack of local knowledge that plagued all escapes. They had no idea that the Salt River was often dry, and even if it weren't, the Gulf was hundreds of miles away. They were captured within weeks, sometimes found exhausted, starving, and often frozen in the desert, realizing the profound futility of their ambition. For the typical prisoner, the effort required to evade capture for more than 48 hours outweighed the desire for freedom. They realized that escape meant trading the safety of a warm barack and 3 square meals a day for the perilous unknowns of the American wilderness, and the near certainty of recapture. The psychological struggle, therefore, shifted from physical escape to mental endurance. The true battle was against demoralization and the constant anxiety for their families overseas. Letters were heavily censored and delayed, creating agonizing uncertainty about the fate of their homes and loved ones under the relentless Allied bombing campaign. The men were safe, enjoying a standard of living that their own citizens could only dream of, yet they were utterly powerless, relegated to watching from afar as their world burned. This profound helplessness, often magnified by the relentless monotony of camp routine, became the dominant psychological pain of the American internment experience. As the war turned decisively against Germany in 1944, the U.S. military formally expanded its efforts from mere containment to active political conversion, initiating the highly controversial Special Projects or Re-Education Program. This endeavor was rooted in the pragmatic belief that if the vast numbers of prisoners could be returned to Germany as anti-Nazis, they would form a vital democratic foundation in the post-war reconstruction. This ambitious scheme was spearheaded by military intelligence and civilian experts, including professors and psychologists, and was initially focused on intellectual engagement. The program included creating camp newspapers, carefully supervised and printed by the prisoners themselves, that provided and censored Allied news and editorials critical of the Nazi regime. Libraries were stocked with books that had been banned in Germany, classics of German literature, philosophy, and political theory, as well as American history and democratic principles. University-level courses were offered, often taught by German prisoners who were already anti-Nazi or former professors, covering everything from engineering to economics, explicitly excluding any pro-Nazi doctrine. The most crucial and often risky component was the selection and training of reliable prisoners, those judged to be genuinely democratic or politically neutral, to act as leaders within the camps. These men were given extra privileges and entrusted with running educational programs, essentially creating a shadow government designed to undermine the authority of the remaining Nazi sympathizers. The program faced immense resistance. Die-hard Nazis boycotted lectures, ridiculed participants, and sometimes resorted to violence against the Democrats. Furthermore, the Geneva Convention complicated matters. Participation had to be entirely voluntary, and the line between education and coercive political indoctrination was often blurry. Crucially, the program was only fully implemented toward the end of the war, meaning that for many men, the process was rushed. However, the impact was undeniable. Thousands of younger men who had never known a Germany without Hitler were exposed for the first time to the concepts of liberalism, representative government, and intellectual freedom. For some, the experience of being treated with respect, allowed to debate, and given access to resources unavailable to fighting men back home, fostered a genuine appreciation for the American system. The ultimate goal was to inoculate a generation against the fascism that had devastated Europe, sending them back to Germany not just as survivors, but as agents of democratic change, ready to rebuild a shattered nation on entirely new principles. The day VE Day arrived, May 8, 1945, created a profound and contradictory emotional chasm across the American POW camps. For the German prisoners, the official end of the European war brought neither celebration nor simple relief, but a torrent of mixed anguish. There was the immediate, visceral joy of realizing their personal safety was secured. They would not be sent back to the front. But this relief was instantly overshadowed by the overwhelming sorrow and fear for their homeland. Their world, their ideology, and their system of government had collapsed utterly. They were men without a nation, stranded safely in the enemy's garden, while their families faced starvation and the immense task of surviving in the ruins. Accounts from several camps described the day as deeply solemn. Many wept, others stood silent, and some, particularly the hardline Nazis, refused to believe the news, convinced it was propaganda designed to break their spirits. American guards watched, realizing that the war might be over for the victors. But for these men, a new, equally daunting struggle was just beginning. The re-education efforts took on a terrifying new urgency after VE Day, particularly with the mandatory viewing of graphic footage from the newly liberated concentration camps. The sheer scale of the horror, undeniable when presented in raw, officially documented film, finally shattered the cognitive shield of denial for most. Men who had argued that the atrocities were exaggerated or fabricated were forced to confront the moral abyss that the regime they swore allegiance to had created. This confrontation was intensely personal. Many struggled with whether they were complicit simply by wearing the uniform. The problem then shifted from, how do we contain them, to how do we repatriate them responsibly? The logistical nightmare of sending hundreds of thousands of men back to a shattered, occupied Germany meant that many prisoners faced a long, indefinite wait. For some, the internment lasted well into 1946 and 1947. During this prolonged post-war waiting period, the prisoners continued to work, often helping with the massive cleanup operations, or even, ironically, preparing American camps for closure. They existed in a bizarre limbo. The war was over, they were free from hostility, yet they could not go home. They developed close, complex relationships with the American civilians and guards, often sharing anxieties about the future of Germany and the inevitable poverty they would face upon return. The American experience, initially a dreaded captivity, had transformed into a refuge, a peaceful, well-fed, and surprisingly educational interregnum between the horrors of combat and the uncertainty of reconstruction. The final stage of the American captivity was the complex, staggered process of repatriation, which began in earnest in 1945 and stretched for some men until late 1947. This was often not a direct return to Germany. Due to logistical constraints and strategic decisions, many German POWs were first shipped to Allied control zones in Europe, particularly the UK and France, where they were held as disarmed enemy forces and used for essential, often grueling, labor clearing mines, rebuilding infrastructure, and harvesting crops. For these men, the return to Europe marked a dramatic and harsh reversal of fortunes. They left the comfortable, well-fed safety of the American heartland for the cold, meager, and dangerous conditions of post-war Europe, often under the guard of soldiers who had suffered directly under German occupation. This interim period served as a final, often brutal, form of atonement and labor before they were finally allowed to step back onto German soil. When they did return, usually through reception centers that processed their identity and political status, they faced a homeland that was unrecognizable. Cities were rubble-strewn, the economy was non-existent, and their families were often displaced or missing. The experience of the American camps provided them with a unique advantage, however. They were generally healthier, better fed, and crucially, many had learned essential skills in the US, engineering, practical English, and rudimentary business management, skills desperately needed for the reconstruction effort. Furthermore, their exposure to democratic ideas, however brief or grudgingly accepted, often positioned them as stabilizing forces in the early, precarious years of the Federal Republic of Germany. The legacy of the American POW experience is multi-layered. For the US, it was a massive, successful logistical undertaking that demonstrated both adherence to international law and effective use of available manpower. For the POWs, It provided a quiet, profound counter-narrative to the totalitarian education they had received. Many men who later became prominent figures in West Germany, including future politicians, businessmen, and academics, credited their time in the American camps with opening their eyes to the possibilities of democracy and the material success achievable in a free society. The American experience was, in the end, far more than just wartime confinement. It was a mass experiment in cultural exposure, forced education, and logistical management that had an undeniable, if subtle, long-term impact on the post-war relationship between the two nations, planting seeds of reconciliation in the most unlikely fields of the American heartland. It stands as a testament to the fact that even in the ultimate conflict, the rules of civilized engagement, when followed, can lead to unexpected and positive outcomes long after the final shot is fired. This story of confinement and transformation, played out across the quiet fields of America, speaks volumes about the complexity of war and peace. If this story touched your heart and gave you a new perspective on the hidden battles fought during history's greatest conflict, please subscribe to WW2 Lore and join us as we continue to explore the legendary aircraft, heroic pilots, and intense history of the American involvement in World War II.